Yeah, and before I ask Jamie to tell me a little bit more about his take on all that, I can definitely confirm that the government reads our stuff because I just got off the phone with Boris Johnson and he was going, Scott was NEC. Was there. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. What is it, week 10 or 11 of the lockdown? In fact, we were chatting, weren't we, guys, that they might let us back in the office in about a month. So maybe by week 14 or something, we'll be in the same room together.
Wearing face masks.
Yeah, wearing face masks and generally sort of, I don't know, looking away from each other. It's not going to be quite the same, is it? So what are we going to chat about this week? So Jamie and I, you were too busy doing important things, Iain. So Jamie and I did a cheeky one on Monday. And now that you're back, I think we're going to chat. Both you and Jamie covered, in fact, all three of us have covered stories involving NEC, who we don't talk about very much in the telecoms context, but we suddenly are now. So that's worth flagging up. Then the sort of megatrend of tech balkanisation had a fair few stories associated with it this week. So I think we'll move on to that. And then lastly, slightly overlapping with that topic, but with some other news as well, we'll talk a bit about the Indian telecoms market. And just to remind you that if you're watching this on the site or on YouTube or on Facebook, you can listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, and loads of other podcasting platforms. It was going so well. That's going to go in the trailer, isn't it, Pierre? I know it. Right. So I should probably stop talking, as I've forgotten how to. I'm going to pass the ball. Or why don't we, Iain, as you were included in the last one, I'll pass the ball to you first. Tell us a little bit about NEC and Rakuten and what you've been covering there.
Yeah, I mean, the big news announced was a couple of big news announcements this week, which I didn't actually cover either of them, but I'm sort of aware of what's going on.
Oh,
but
dear.
They had a big sort of press conference earlier in the week, and they announced NEC as their 5G core partner, basically, which sort of builds on a relationship they've already got because NEC's playing a pretty big role on the radio side already. They're one of the companies that's building the 5G radios for the Rakuten rollout. And then they've also popped up apparently in discussions about the UK. This is all based on, I think Bloomberg originally got the scoop that the UK government sort of reached out and held discussions with them as well as Samsung about, bringing in companies as an alternative to Huawei, which area they'd come into is unclear. But yeah, sorry, go on, Scott.
Yeah, I hadn't realised that you hadn't specifically covered that because I was chatting to you about it, and you're so knowledgeable, I just assume you had covered it. But Jamie did for us. So before I ask him to sort of dig down into that specific story a bit more, Iain, I haven't really, in the 6 years I've been I just had recently my 6-year anniversary of this job. I only knew because people on LinkedIn were going, "Oh, well done." I haven't really covered NEC much as a telecoms vendor. So perhaps you can give us a bit of a background about NEC and whether we should be taking it more seriously.
I mean, they're like Fujitsu's another one that's sort of been there, but not, it's not sort of, its name doesn't come up that much because the market's so heavily skewed these days. So you only ever really hear about the big three, and if you're not hearing about the big three, you hear about the next two, which is Samsung and ZTE. The big three being Ericsson, Huawei, and Nokia, which I think you're talking about radio. The estimates vary, but I think Vodafone was saying they reckon they've got up to sort of 80% of the RAN market, and then most of the rest of it's filled by ZTE and Samsung. And then you've got these smaller companies coming along trying to do interesting things with Open RAN, which we talk about quite a lot on this podcast, as a sort of more disaggregated RAN where you can have more companies coming in and doing bits of it. But NEC's been there, and they're interesting at the moment because they've sort of been, I mean, it's very much linked to Open RAN. Rakuten has kind of picked them as like a local champion of that technology and a company that can come along and help it do all these exciting things with its greenfield network in Japan. And it gives them a stature that perhaps they didn't have up beforehand because Rakuten's so closely watched around the world because it's this, it's the first example of a kind of greenfield network in a highly developed market, being built nationally, using, all this modern cloud native stuff. It's not just Open RAN, it's the whole kind of core side of it as well. Everything's supposed to be disaggregated and making more use of open source and software and cloud technologies. So because they're being linked with this so strongly, they've kind of got this higher profile, I think, than they had. They've done pretty well on the marketing side out of it. And you kind of sense that other companies, I remember talking to them a few weeks ago when Rakuten was originally, announcing plans about its 4G launch and its 5G launch. And even then they were saying they were kind of getting expressions of interest from other operators. So you kind of wonder whether the UK government's probably been aware of this, might even have read some of the stories that you guys and we've written and that we've written about NEC and what it's doing with Rakuten. They're kind of obviously paying attention to the whole Open RAN thing because it's so political in the States. And they're in quite, if that technology can work, if it can be proven, they're in quite a good position, I think, to sort of come in as one of the players trying to take advantage of it. And what's happened this week on the core network side with Rakuten's interesting as well, because that market isn't quite as dominated, but it's still heavily skewed towards a few players. I think Del Oro, which is the kind of main sort of market research forecasting institution that gets taken seriously by the vendors, that I think they were saying this week that Ericsson and Huawei together have about half of that mobile core market, and then another quarter is accounted for by by the other guys like Nokia, ZTE, and Samsung. So for Cisco as well. Sorry, Cisco's very much in there. But for Rakuten to come along, having worked actually with Cisco on the 4G side and pick NEC, it's kind of similar to what happened with the radio access network, where they've been working with Nokia to some extent on 4G, and then they've kind of gone for this local champion that they're saying is, it's cheaper, it's doing things in a more kind of agile way than the other vendors that have been using. So it's brilliant marketing for them.
Yeah. Kind
of interesting move in terms of what it means for the development of the market and the vendor makeup, and just quite interesting because of those two things, I think.
Yeah, and I'll, before I ask Jamie to tell me a little bit more about his take on all that, I can definitely confirm that the government reads our stuff, because I just got off the phone with Boris Johnson and he was going, Scott was NEC. No.
Almost like Matt Lucas.
Yes. In fact, it was Matt Lucas. He's really into telecoms. But Jamie, you picked an interesting angle. Anyway, I'm going to pick up on the UK angle with NEC in a sec. But Jamie, your angle was, your headline was Rakuten takes first step towards a hybrid operator/vendor telco. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about that angle?
Yeah, well, this is part of, although, obviously the Open RAN network and building a network from scratch at Rakuten is a very, very interesting development. But for me, I think the most interesting element of this entire sort of movement is the creation of a new type of company. Now, obviously, Rakuten has not been shy about the fact that it said, if we can make this work, we're going to sell it to other people. So you're effectively going to have a telco operator which sells subscriptions to consumers in Japan. So it operates as a traditional MNO, but then it also sells networking platforms which are software defined, as would a virtualized vendor. So you got this telco which just doesn't exist today. It's creating its own network, but then it's actually selling how it develops the network, and it's selling the technology to potential rivals. Now, I just think that's a really, really interesting dynamic. A lot of people might say that you're blunting your swords and you're eroding your edge if you sell the family jewels. But very, very few other networks can take a fully virtualized, fully software orientated approach like Rakuten. It'll be bit parts. They're buying an aspect of the core that they can implement in their own market, or some sort of backhaul solution, or something about a billing or aggregation. You're buying different components, but you're marrying it with legacy. So no one's going to be able to do this entirely sort of open greenfield cloud approach to delivering networks like Rakuten can. which is why I think it's confident enough that it can sell these ideas to potential rivals. And I think I don't think there's many other telcos who would have the stomach to actually do that. They're still run by traditional guys.
And as you say, it makes you think, why hasn't it happened before? And as you say, the reason it happened before is because everyone else is doing more or less the same thing, just a bunch of different off-the-peg bits of sort of BSS, OSS, this, that, and the other, plumbing, as I like to call it, and whacking it all together, but not necessarily in an amazingly unique way, whereas they are, and that thus they've got something that's marketable. And the other thing that's probably worth pointing out, Jamie, is outside of Japan, of course, they wouldn't be selling to direct rivals. I suppose the IP could find its way back to SoftBank or Docomo or whatever. Do you know if they're in any way prohibiting their direct Japanese rivals from buying this stuff as well?
No, I don't think so. I don't think they could get away with doing that, to be honest. No. I bet you there's some sort of competition law or antitrust law that says you can't pick and choose your customers like that. But I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I see consolidation happening across the industry, internationally as well, especially with especially with these new sort of greenfield markets emerging. Like if Rakuten does this product and does it well and creates a really successful business which undercuts the market, and the work that Iain's been doing is incredibly profitable because you haven't got thousands of engineers you have to pay in the back end, and you can roll out updates super quick, and you can be sleek and savvy. Why on earth couldn't it launch in another market? There's absolutely no reason why it couldn't go, well, we can take the exact same model that we've used in Japan, and I don't know, let's do it in Germany. Why not? We could. There is absolutely no reason, because let's not forget, Rakuten isn't a traditional telco. It's basically Japan's version of AWS, isn't it? Of Amazon. It's an internet player. It's super savvy, so it thinks differently than traditional telcos. So and the likes of Amazon, Google, Baidu, Alibaba, Rakuten, they don't think about borders. They just think about tech as a way to make money. So why shouldn't they think about launching this product in another market under their own brands?
And so the NEC, you two can correct me if I got this wrong. I think their work with Rakuten's mainly in the core. Is that right?
This product that we're talking about this week specifically is they're doing it. They've launched a containerized standalone core product. Core,
and earlier on they were announced as a radio partner.
Right, of course, yeah. You said
so the announcement this week's just about the core, but they're making the they're basically developed. So they're doing they're an example of Open RAN. They're providing radio units for 5G. On certain spectrum bands, which I won't say because I've been told before by the CTO, but I can't remember off the top of my head. Okay. And Altiostar Software is basically running over that.
Right. So the thing I'm leading up to is we haven't chatted about NEC much. I just had a little look on the tag NEC on Telecoms.com, and before the couple of stories we wrote this week, I don't think we'd written about them for about a year or two. Is it specifically this Open RAN development that is making NEC much more viable and a much more prominent player? Or is there also, the other thing I'm wondering, and this is kind of overlapping with the second segment, but it's relevant, the fact that NEC is Japanese. And so there's a degree of sort of
I think it's
national champion.
I think it's both. And I think it's interesting they've gone for, in the core, where there's more sensitivity, arguably. We've seen restrictions introduced there already by operators themselves in the UK. Vodafone and BT very sort of resistant to having Chinese vendors in the core. BT's been working on getting Huawei out of that area for a while, even before everything that's been going on in the last few months. And European Commission's more concerned about that area. I think there's, picking a local player is much more sort of palatable, perhaps, I think, in that respect. So I think that's probably helped them there. And they're very key. I mean, you listen to Tarek Amin in press conferences. He's very much into the whole. He's not Japanese himself, but he's very much into sort of trying to promote Japan as a place that does really high-tech technology, and there seems to be a slightly sort of nationalistic angle coming out sometimes, in it's almost like he's been tasked with doing something with local expertise as much as possible. There's not a lot of Japanese technology apart from NEC, but they do have a very prominent role. I mean, you look at the vendor list they've got, which is huge. Actually, most of the players are US. Most of the partners are US companies. But the other important thing to note is one of those US companies, which is, again, very, very key in the project, Altiostar, is a company that Rakuten has a majority stake in. So even there they have, and then on the BSS side, again, a really important part of the network. Who is it? It's NEC, whose owner. Sorry, it's Netcracker, whose owner is NEC.
Right.
So I think there is this sort of. I think it's two things. I think Open RAN, in the same way that it gives players like Mavenir and players in other parts of the value chain an opportunity to get into a market that's really been dominated by a handful of players. Yeah, that helps NEC as well. But I think there's a kind of local champion side to this as well.
Yeah. I think the other thing you've got to think about as well is that when you actually work this sort of work, it kind of makes sense to work with someone who's in your country as well. I mean, you're on the same time zone. If you want to go to their offices to talk about projects, they're just around the corner. Culturally, I mean, let's not forget that Japan culturally is a very, very, very different place from almost everywhere in the world. They've got a very, very unique culture. So if you're going to have a project work smoothly, it's probably best to bring in another company who understands that culture, how Japanese businessmen operate, how they think, how businesses actually function. I mean, it kind of makes sense just to go with a local player. And to be perfectly honest, there's the other thing is, why not? I mean, there's no leadership table here. I mean, anyone, you've got the likes of Mavenir and Parallel Wireless and all, those companies saying that we're the best in the world. Well, prove it. There's no evidence. Your product isn't in any live commercial networks at the moment. And if it is, it's had so little exposure to heavy or strain, you can't actually prove that your product is better. It's all marketing fluff at the moment. So there is no wrong decision. Realistically, Rakuten is probably going to fail. And most of the time, the first time that people do it, it usually
goes wrong. Yeah. No, I totally agree on the cultural side. And actually, he was on, that's a really interesting point, because he was on a symposium that Light Reading did yesterday, Tariq Amin, talking about the core. And it's very clear that they sort of view this relationship with NEC not in the traditional kind of operator-vendor way. We do an RFP and then someone comes in. They're very much sort of presenting them as technology partners. Now, to make a relationship like that work, it's, as Jamie's saying, very, very helpful to have a local partner, someone who's down the road, someone who understands the kind of cultural norms of the market you're working in and all this sort of thing. And you said we're pushing them really hard to do things that haven't been done before. And expressing quite a bit of dissatisfaction actually with the way things have. How do I put it? I mean, he's basically saying the network they've got at the moment, the one that's kind of been built based on the 4G core, and it's very virtualized, but it's not. It hasn't gone far enough. Basically, a lot of the virtual machines they're using, it's not containerized yet. They've really had to kind of drive NEC towards doing some of this stuff for them. Well, it's a lot easier to do that when you're working with someone in the same market, someone who understands things the same way that you do.
Yeah. And as you touched on, NEC, this has helped its profile no end. And the UK government, as according to, as you say, the Bloomberg story that I sort of read on South China Morning Post, partly so I didn't use up my feeble allocation of like 3 Bloomberg stories a month I could look at without having to pay them. The government's been chatting to NEC about getting its help with 5G. And it was an interesting story because some of the premises of the story were a little bit flawed. For example, they were saying that no one vendor can replace Huawei. Well, certainly Ericsson and Nokia do everything in wireless that Huawei does, to the best of my knowledge. So that was a weird premise. And there were just one or two other things that just gave me the impression that the piece was written by maybe a business or political journalist, but not a telecoms journalist.
I
But
think that's
go on. Yeah, sorry.
I mean, I think that's something that you see quite a lot when Huawei's written about, and that's the Huawei machine at work to some extent. I think speaking to journalists, and I mean, we've got to be careful here. They are a technology leader. Yeah, there's no doubt that Huawei does things extremely well. They have very advanced technology. You talk to analysts in some areas, they're clearly seen as being ahead. Is it irreplaceable? No. It's not like you can't build a network without Huawei, because a lot of operators have done it. And it's not just in America. You have other countries, other operators that are far less reliant on Huawei. So to suggest that I think the main issue for a lot of the UK operators is, there's two things. One is if they have to get rid of it immediately, that really leaves them in the lurch. They need Nick Reed with Vodafone was sort of alluding to this. And Vodafone's apparently very, very heavily dependent on Huawei across Europe, I've been hearing. But, he was saying, saying we need time really to adjust. We can't just be told that it has to go. It needs to be, a process that happens over a certain amount of time. And there are costs involved in replacing a vendor of that size that serves so much of your market. So I think that's one issue for them. Another one is they don't want to lose the competition. Huawei's come in and offered extremely good products at very competitive rates. Started off being regarded as a kind of copycat, just ripping off Western innovation. I don't think anybody would regard it as a copycat these days in areas like massive MIMO and some of this stuff. They're very much seen as the leader. So if you lose them as a competitor and you go, in a market that's already very consolidated, what are you talking about? You've only really got Ericsson and Nokia as options, which isn't a position anybody wants to be in. So those are the main concerns, I think. But to say it's irreplaceable is just sort of really exaggerating it.
Yeah, it seems a bit hyperbolic, and whether or not they'd had Huawei's PR people whispering in their ears or not, we won't know. Although I should note that Huawei is also setting up a briefing, I think, next week, where they want to chat about recent developments. To the best of my knowledge, they haven't specified what they are, but my best guess would be it would be this UK review. And that kind of brings us on to the Balkanisation topic, because, whether or not the story is true remains to be seen, and whether or not the government should be chatting to NEC as opposed to someone else is up for debate. But there's also the fact, why should the government be poking its nose into this shit at all? My issue with governments poking their nose into markets, other than just a free market purist point of view, is they're not very good at it. The whole point of a free market is it's the most efficient allocation of capital, because companies with a massive stake in the area they're involved in, answerable to shareholders with all these fiduciary responsibilities, will tend to make, and I say tend to because obviously there are plenty of examples of them making bad choices, but will tend to make the best choice for their commercial circumstances. And so you'd think, for example, if NEC was such a brilliant call, then we'd have all the UK operators chatting to them independently without the need for the government to sort of catalyse the whole process.
Yeah, I thought it was a bit odd as well. I mean, I don't know what, it's all reported obviously by Bloomberg, so we don't really know what's happened and whether it's just a sort of attempt by the government to establish whether these are viable alternatives before it does anything that might, limit competition. And it's really just a sort of inquiry, or whether it's something. I mean, certainly if the government's going out and trying to pick technology companies that should come in and be directed to work with Vodafone, say, or BT, that would be really, really strange. And also you wonder why
tell them to go and shove it.
Yeah, and you wonder why they can't get this. I mean, this is presumably why they have so many conversations with the operators themselves. Is it viable? This is presumably why they imposed the restrictions that they did. 35%, but still allowing Huawei a role was, I'm guessing, based on long conversations with people like Vodafone and BT, where those operators were saying, well, we can't just get rid of them. We're going to end up setting 5G back a couple of years. We're going to end up having to spend quite a lot of money on rip-out costs, which they've already incurred as a result of that decision. I think BT's saying about 500 million, isn't it, over the next few years to replace Huawei. So it was like a compromise, really, that was made, I'm guessing, after they've spoken with the operators. And the operators know the market. They know what equipment's available. They know whether NEC is viable. They know whether Samsung is. They're looking at all these options, I'm sure. So why? Yeah, I agree. Why is the government approaching those players rather than approaching the service providers and relying on them to make the inquiries they will be making?
And I think the answer to that question is just political posturing. And this is the problem. I understand why they need to politically posture because, not presumably, we know they've been coming under loads of heat from the US ever since they made the decision back in January about Huawei. And that heat will have intensified with coronavirus and the increasing bad press that China as a country has got in response to how transparent it was at the early stages of the pandemic and all that kind of stuff. And so they're obviously having a rethink. Quite a lot of Tory MPs have been having a strop about it as well. I still maintain my position even now that if the government's best advice was that there's a threshold at which they could manage the security threat, then they were right to follow that advice. But I have to concede that there are political considerations. It's also interconnected. We've got Brexit. We're looking to make new trade deals. Not a great time to be pissing off the Americans. All that sort of stuff. So they're obviously under political pressure to be seen to be doing something. And on top of whether or not at the end of a review they decide, nah, we're not going to let Huawei be a vendor in any 5G networks at all, which, as we've discussed many times, will make life very difficult for some of the UK operators, certainly if they're not given sufficient time to do the business. They presumably are chatting to NEC just to say, look how proactive we're being, look how involved we're being. We're looking at everything. And they're echoing the US efforts to look at Open RAN as a sort of panacea for solving this over dependency for your communications network on vendors from countries you don't like. So that's where I think they're coming from there. So on the topic of sort of balkanization and telecoms networks, we think that's probably worked in Ericsson's favour to some extent, don't we? I mean, I wrote about this, but I think you've had a look at it as well, Iain. They got a nice deal win in Canada, and a couple of other things have gone their way. Why don't you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, well, there's two deal wins in Canada. There's TELUS and BCE. TELUS actually named, I hope I'm going to get this the right way around, I think TELUS named Nokia and Ericsson as 5G suppliers. BCE named Ericsson. And as I understand it, both companies have worked with Huawei in the 4G days. So you sort of alarm bells ring when you see that happening, because it sounds like they're replacing Huawei and moving in the kind of Nordic vendors instead. I'm not sure it's 100% clear that's happened. I mean, I got in touch with Bell Canada, and they were saying, I mean, they sort of sent me a statement saying we would consider using Huawei in 5G if we get explicit permission from the Canadian government, which is obviously the Canadian government has been under pressure the same way the UK one has from the US as a member of Five Eyes not to use Huawei at all. It sounds like, similar things been going on over there, kind of bit of toing and froing about what they should do. But then again, you make a decision like this, it almost sounds like you've moved ahead. You've decided to do something and kind of take a firm decision about which vendors you're going to introduce. And
Huawei they can't sit and wait for the government, can they?
They can't just keep waiting. They had to move ahead and do something. So, and I think you heard as well, Scott, you got something from them about the
I'll tell you that I just asked Ericsson when I was writing the story, and credit to you, this was prompted by a sort of chat I'd had with you prior to that. And I asked them if the contract, this is specifically the Bell Canada one, if the contract significantly expanded their market share with Bell compared to what they had with 4G, and they confirmed that it does. They didn't give any specifics, but there's clearly been a market share shift at Bell Canada in favour of Ericsson with this deal.
Yeah, and TELUS, I got in touch with the CTO directly actually because he's come to a few of our events in the past, so I just emailed him and he didn't want to comment, but they've at least he got back and said I don't want to comment because it's obviously a bit sensitive. But they've basically announced Nokia and Ericsson, so it's kind of a rare instance actually for where Nokia has been named recently, and Huawei seems to have lost out. A lot of these swaps that have been happening. I put a little table together in the story I'd done where there's quite a number now of cases where Ericsson's come in as the vendor that has sort of replaced Huawei. Huawei even mentioned this on its earnings call earlier in the year. They sort of admitted the deals they'd lost, and it's always been Ericsson that's come in. And it's just in a good situation at the moment, Ericsson. I mean, it's got this thing going. It never wants to comment on this, obviously. It doesn't want to get involved in the geopolitics because it wants to be friends with everybody. And it's got a big business in China to sort of worry about. But they've done a pretty good job of getting things together on the 5G side under new management. You know, they've got a product that's regarded as very competitive. They've got all this backlash going on against Huawei, which puts them in a really good position as a vendor you come and choose. And at the same time, Nokia's had this, couple of years now of problems on its 5G product roadmap. It's had these difficulties that have been widely reported, and things haven't been going very well. So if you think they're the only three real sort of viable options on a kind of global scale, they're in, an Open RAN's still not really ready for prime time. It's going to be a while before anybody can, aside from a couple of cases like Rakuten maybe in Dish. They're in a great position, Ericsson, at the moment. If this kind of carries on to sort of pick up business. So when they were saying earlier in the year, we were kind of quite optimistic about this year, despite all the rubbish that's going on with the pandemic and the economic slowdown, I was pretty skeptical. I mean, I think I wrote something saying I can't see it. And I was sort of thinking that there's going to be quite a big slowdown, I think, in 5G investments in some markets. Now, I think that's still going to happen. But I think they can probably pick up enough stuff elsewhere. Got these Canadian business coming. There's still quite a lot of momentum in the US. They did better in China than I think some people were expecting, where Nokia lost very badly. They're in quite a good situation at the moment, Ericsson.
And did we mention Telefonica Deutschland as well? Because that was at the start of the week.
We didn't. No, that's another one. Yeah, that's on the core side, and again on the core network side, they seem to have been doing quite well. As the player that's come in, Ericsson. Yeah. So they had a deal with BT for a while. Has been looking for a replacement for Huawei, and we knew that they were actually looking at Cisco and Nokia as well. That had been confirmed, but Ericsson was chosen as the vendor to come in there. And then Telefonica Deutschland has also picked. I think it was this week, wasn't it? Start of the week. They've named Ericsson basically as the kind of 5G core supplier. So they do. Yeah, it's not just the radio they're doing well, and they're doing pretty well on the kind of core network side of things as well.
Okay, and we should actually. It reminds me, we've been talking about people sort of pushing back on China, but it's Jamie who wrote about that Telefonica Deutschland thing, but he included it in a broader story about 5G core networks, and Jamie, you said that. China's leading the way there based on some Deloro numbers, so that we've still got some catching up to do. Is that how we see it?
Yeah, well, if you actually have a look at where the big acceleration in 5G is, it is China, and there's you obviously have multiple cores in a network. I mean, sort of like the actual physical product. We designate it as the core as a singularity, but you actually have more than one. If you look at the sheer size of China and the distribution of its population, there's just more money to be made there. Iain, I think you've said it numerous times that the RAN market is going to be 60% Chinese companies or something like that. This goes for every other segment of the telco market as well. It may not be as aggressive as 60%, but fiber for backhaul. You're going to have to put if you're going to make 5G work everywhere, you need to have full fiber. Not everywhere, but for as far as possible. And the sheer size of China means that there's going to be some big optical contracts on the horizon for the likes, for China Telecom, for this China broadcast network. Everyone, It's kind of like patents, the sheer volume of commercial contract wins is largely irrelevant unless you're actually dining at the top table with the biggest contracts. So this is where Samsung has got a significant advantage at the moment, in that Chinese companies are banned from the US. The US is a massive market as well, so Samsung can make a lot of money if it can get into bed with the right companies. The same could be said with Canada. It's another massive, massive market. So you've got to look at these key contracts, and Canada, US, India, Russia, and China. These huge populations, geographically vast, and the number of base stations is going to be humongous. Whoever's winning those contracts are going to be the most profitable countries. It might be great to win, Three's RAN contracts, but realistically, that's probably at most, let's say, even if they have network expansion and they what do they call it when you make it more? I can't remember the term. But if you put more base stations in a smaller area,
capacity,
densification.
Densification, that's the one. Even if you have expansion and densification strategies, you're still probably looking at a max of 20 to 25,000 base stations in the UK. Now, 25 to 25,000 base stations, when you look at the size of some of these cities out in China, that's a contract. I mean, it's mental. It's mental. So irrelevant of how many international contracts you have, unless you're winning the big ones, you're not going to be the number one in the market.
And you mentioned India, and I'm going to invite you to talk a little bit more about the Indian market to finish as our last segment. But there was an interesting sort of symbol of the Balkanisation megatrend in India this week, which was there was an app available in India, and it is called Remove China Apps. And the purpose of the app was just to identify Chinese apps and help you remove them. Now, it was up for about a couple of weeks, and then Google took it down, ostensibly because the Android T's and C's say apps that help you get rid of other apps are not allowed. Whether or not that was the only reason, or whether or not China had a word, we won't know. But before it was taken down, at one stage, it was the number one trending Android download in the whole of India. And I think it's downloaded something like 5 million times. I had a little look at the page of the developer, and they made reference to a recent speech by the Indian Premier Modi, where he was talking about a sort of India first kind of strategy. So it's happening absolutely everywhere. And he's an India first strategy. A few weeks ago, they'd passed some law preventing the acquisition of Indian companies by any country they have a land border with, which is very clearly directed at China, with all due respect to Nepal and Afghanistan. So they're really retrenching. And there's been talking about the border, there's actually been some border aggro between India and China, a place called the Galwan Valley, I think it was, which is up in that part of the world where about 4 or 5 different stands all border with China and India. That part of the world that sort of Genghis Khan used to go through on his way to battering Europe. I think I don't know if you guys ever seen a film called The Man Who Would Be King. It's that kind of part of the world.
Sean Connery, isn't it? And Michael
exactly.
Caine.
Sean Connery and Michael Caine. Exactly. Classic film. I think Sean Connery ended up marrying the actress. And anyway, bit of a tangent there. So there's that part of the world. And something like that. And they've been aggroing over that, and it's not like it's of geopolitical significance. It's not like there's oil there. It's not like there's vineyards there. It looks like a fairly sort of mountainous, scrappy bit of land, but it seems to be the belligerent, from what I read. Granted, this was of Indian origin, so it could be biased. The belligerent was China. They were doing some saber rattling. They were sort of like sticking their toe over the border and going, "What are you going to do about it?" And this seems to be consistent with a general bit of a raising of sort of Chinese argy-bargy, things like those islands in the South China Sea and all that sort of stuff that they get up to. So yes, I just thought that app was a really interesting manifestation, because Modi's speech about India first, I'm paraphrasing, he didn't specifically say that. He didn't say, "Make India great again," and with a red cap on. But there's a bit of that sentiment going on, and the Indians seem to be taking it quite seriously because they seem to be, on the evidence of that app, quite keen on getting rid of Chinese apps from their phones. So that's just yet another bit of circumstantial evidence of this Balkanisation mega trend. But I'm going to, on the subject of India, I think it is arguably the most exciting telecoms market in the world right now. I'm going to invite Jamie to tell us a little bit more about whether he agrees, and if so, why.
There's just a lot going on with the telcos at the moment. I mean, obviously the Geo is a very disruptive player, but there's been a lot of investment in the telecommunications companies from sort of international investors. But most of it today, in particular, there's an Abu Dhabi investment fund which has purchased 1.85% of Geo platforms, such as the business unit of Reliance Industries, which contains Reliance Geo, the telecommunications companies, plus all the other digital ventures. But there's, I mean, the fascinating thing I think about India is just its sheer weighty potential of it. And I was having a drill down to the numbers today for while I was looking at the potential of Reliance Geo. When you actually have a look at the number of subscriptions, 4G subscriptions to start with, there's only 754 million. Now that is roughly, I'd say, probably about 55 to 60% market penetration for 4G, whereas most developed markets exceed something like 130 to anywhere up to sort of like 180% market penetrations in terms of the number of 4G SIM cards compared to the total population. So from a very basic level, there's still a significant number of SIM cards and contracts which can be sold to the Indian population. Huge amount of cash which can be made there, even if the data is remarkably cheap. But then the other really, really beautifully interesting part of this is once you've got connectivity, there is basically a free-for-all to develop the ecosystem after that, which I think is where most people make their money. Think about the telecommunications company makes X amounts by selling a SIM card, but then everyone else who uses who is an internet company makes 10x. But off the connectivity, the likes of Facebook, Airbnb, digital payment companies, all these guys. And that doesn't exist yet in India. And then the even bigger opportunity, which I absolutely think is ridiculously fascinating, is a lack of traditional banking infrastructure. So if, we've already seen in developing markets in Africa, where the lack of a traditional banking infrastructure can result in the likes of orange money taking off, and these sorts of initiatives. I can't remember what the Vodacom one is called, or the Vodafone one. There's a really, really popular one. M-Pesa, that's the one. So there's some really. Yeah, I think it's a pair of trainers that I've ordered. But that is a massive opportunity for India, because there's so many people and there's so little banking infrastructure. Give me 2 seconds. I'm just going to have you talk about that point. Juliet's gone. No, she's gone. She's beat me to it.
It's all good. I was going to say, I was wondering if you were mic'd up and we were going to hear you chatting to the delivery guy.
I think Juliet's gone, so that's fine.
New trainers, cool.
Yeah.
I got 10 litres of ale through today, so...
You got what through?
10 litres of ale.
Oh, right, okay.
Good man.
I haven't got any in at the moment, so I've got some 0%ers.
2 kegs straight from the brewery.
Wow. Jamie and Iain going in opposite directions here.
Yeah.
I'm
still running, so I'm running it off.
Yeah. Well, I live just around the corner for you now, so I can pop round for a pint later on.
You can if you want. Yeah. You're more than welcome.
Well, I'm allowed to do so now as well.
Where were you, Jamie?
So I think there is a lot of money to be made if you just want to invest in a telco. But the beautiful thing about Reliance Jio is that Ambani seems to have this digital vision that telcos are the vehicle to take the Indian economy to these digital fortunes through payment plans. Like he said, that he's going to partner with WhatsApp and Facebook so they can start creating products for SMEs so they can take payments online as opposed to dealing with traditional cash. He's like the investor today that came in, the Abu Dhabi Investment Fund, also owns a satellite comms company. So in terms of international roaming for Geo and filling in the holes of the connectivity in the Indian rural countryside, that's a great partner to have as one of your investors. And I just think that there's so many like opportunities that can be made in India because no one's really developed a digital ecosystem there. So democratize connectivity through 4G. You've still got 40% of SIM cards to make, which is a shitload of money to be fighting over. And then off the back of that, whoever can land like the social media platform or be the next digital payments master, or if Netflix can get in as the most popular streaming partner to 1 billion, to how many households are there? Like 300 million households, or how many there is. There's such a ridiculous amount of money there to be made.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right. There's so much latent potential, and you look at what happened to China 10 or 20 years ago with its boom that was founded in large part on digital. That kind of potential's there, and that explains why we're seeing all these rumors. Obviously Facebook bought into Geo Platforms a few weeks ago, and since then it's been mainly sort of venture capital. But we've had rumors about Google buying into Vodafone Idea. This week we had rumor about Amazon buying into Bharti Airtel. And so you're getting all these web scale US companies contemplating investing, and presumably it's exactly what Jamie is describing, just to have access to this amazing potential.
The remarkable thing about these, this is one of the other things that I wanted to point to, because I've had to dig down into the numbers. The remarkable thing about it is that Reliance Jio is so far ahead of the competition when it comes to actually collecting 4G subscriptions as well. If you actually have a look at market share, go from 1G to 5G, and it looks like Bharti Airtel and Vodacom Idea are actually competing on a level peg with Reliance Jio. But if you just narrow down the search to 4G subscriptions, they're getting blown out of the water. Yeah. Now, this is Omdia data, so one of our sister companies, which has been helping me out here. Reliance Jio a forecast for 2021 to have 403 million 4G subscriptions. Vodafone Idea, it's 110 million, and Bharti Airtel is 219 million. So when you actually just look at the 4G market, the other two are just nowhere near Reliance Jio. So Facebook has got it, even if like Amazon or want to buy into Bharti Airtel or Google, that's the other rumor that's been around, is pitching 2 billion to Vodafone Idea. They're so far behind at the moment, it becomes almost an impossibility to see them overturning this lead.
Yeah, it's a challenge, but the cash could help them do that. I think the Indian market's probably, I'd need to look at the data, so I'm making an assumption here, but I bet it's heavily prepaid, which means there won't be too much subscriber stickiness, and everything that benefited Jio in the first place in terms of people defecting from the incumbents because Jio was offering loads of free shit could, in theory, happen back the other way. It comes down to money, and it feels like there's going to be a money arms race. If one lot get 2 billion off Google, another lot get 2 billion off Amazon, suddenly they're all chucking money into that. And I think that's probably great news for Indian consumers, not just in terms of them being offered cheap services, but in terms of there being a vibrant sort of infrastructure build out on the back of all this extra cash they have.
Yeah, but you got to look at what's actually happening at the moment. I mean, this is where I just can't see it being turned around, because you look at the advantage that Reliance Jio has, and it's similar. It's nowhere near the same as Rakuten, but Reliance
Better
Jio
platform,
has been. Yeah, it's been building a network over the last 5, 6, 7 years. Bharti Airtel, Vodafone, Idea, all these companies, they've had existing networks there that are reliant on the clunky, they're horrible legacy networks, which they have to upgrade. It's like taking the. I know it's not the same as Rakuten, but it is similar. And the other thing you got to consider is sheer volume of cash. Reliance Jio has collected 10 billion over the last 7 weeks. 2 billion is a scratch on that. But then also, like, success compounds on success. 400 million 4G subscriptions to sell digital services on top of. That's a lot of money to be reinvesting in, compared to 200 million to sell digital services on top of. And Bharti Airtel's digital service ecosystem isn't anywhere near as developed as the Reliance Jio one is. I think it's just everything is stacked for Reliance Jio, and I just think that this whole disruptive strategy that has been in place over the last 5 years is just coming to a head now, and you just got to sit back and just go, wow, this guy knows what he's doing. And and Barney, you've got to give him credit. This is a remarkably good business.
Yeah, and he's got a few rupees to chuck around, to be fair. Iain, do you reckon the other two incumbents, Bharti Airtel and Vodafone Idea, have got a fighting chance?
Maybe, I don't know. It's going to be hard for them, like Jamie says. I mean, it doesn't help the sort of government. I mean, they would argue the government policy hasn't exactly been in their favour, and I think we've all written about this before. The sort of display of favouritism to some extent towards Jio. It's almost like the the Indian government has sort of set out to punish the other players, and Vodafone Idea would certainly regard it that way, as quite a sort of hostile environment, I think, for companies from outside India. Maybe that ties in with what you're saying to some extent, Scott, that there's kind of a sort of nationalistic streak going through Indian government policy, I think, at the moment, promotion of national champions and trying to favour kind of Indian companies. And Reliance Jio's, is the biggest part of the biggest Indian conglomerate. So they sort of lean towards it. So I think that's helped them to some extent. I think the network side, as Jamie was saying, definitely. I remember meeting a couple of the guys quite senior on the network side at the TM Forum event, I think a few years ago. And, even then, I mean, it's not perhaps where Rakuten is, but the guy at Rakuten, Tariq Amin, actually was the man who did the Jio network. He's the guy who developed it all. So it's very, very automated. It's, I think they've talked about this in the past. They, the same way that Rakuten thinks it can pass these cost savings onto customers and just have a kind of profitable business by undercutting rivals because its technology is so much more efficient. There's an element of that going on in India as well with Jio. They've talked about this, the margins being a lot healthier from a kind of, network perspective and what they can sort of offer over the top of the network. So they've got a lot of advantages that I think, it's going to be hard for the other operators to turn that around. And, they've got, their finances aren't in the best shape either. This is the problem. It's not like they're in a great situation this year. So it's going to be a real uphill struggle for them, I think.
Yeah, talking about a government, there's those great big sort of back bills for historical license fees and all that kind of stuff that's still hanging over them. I just think it's interesting. I mean, I don't disagree with what both of you two have said about the intrinsic advantage that Jio has, and that's been clear for a little while since it got off to such a flyer. I just think it's interesting that the likes of Amazon and Google are sniffing around the other two. It could be that it was catalysed by Facebook's investment in Jio. And maybe Jio's now, while it's accepted a lot more investment, it hasn't come from any other actual tech companies. It's all come from VCs and sovereign wealth funds and all that sort of thing. So maybe it's, maybe one of the stipulations with Facebook is it doesn't let any other US web scale companies invest. And so they're thinking, all right, A, if we want a piece of the action, we're going to have to look elsewhere. And B, maybe there's a real opportunity here with sort of relatively distressed assets in the form of those other two, for us to get a really serious stake in a massive market at a bargain price. So I think regardless of how it plays out, and I agree the smart money is on Geo, I think that sector is going to be worth keeping an eye on for a while. And I think it's probably good news for Indian consumers and good news for the Indian economy, and arguably good news for the world to have another super populous country have a much sort of larger and more prosperous sort of middle class and aspiration, bringing people out of poverty and peasant lifestyle and earning a few more quid or rupees, I should say. So yeah, I agree. I think it's absolutely fascinating. I'm sure we'll be talking about it again. Cool. All right, then. I think we're more or less done. I'll take that pause from the two of you. Say you got nothing else to interject on India and all that jazz. And I think we've done about an hour anyway. So I'll wrap it up there. So Jamie, you going around Ian's house to have some of his keg of beer now? Is that what's going on?
Try some of this ale that he's got.
You are welcome anytime. Yeah.
I think it'd only be about a 20-minute walk there as well, isn't it?
It's a 20-minute walk. You can come and sit in the garden. Yeah, I mean the weather's not so bad at the moment. It's up to you, mate. I'll send you my postcode if you want to come over.
It was just pissing down with rain about 20 minutes ago. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you want to nip over, or we can meet in Wandsworth Common and do what all the other pissheads are doing there at the moment on a regular basis.
Yeah, by the sounds of it, it's carnage on Wandsworth Common.
It's pretty busy in the evenings. Is one bit of it, yeah, with the pubs sort of serving takeaway beer. Yeah.
Well, if you two do meet up, I demand a Zoom call so I can at least join in remotely.
Yeah,
cool.
Okay, we'll do that.
On that note, I'll wrap it up. Thank you very much for listening, and make sure you join us for the next one.